We are delighted to present Dublin One City Many Stories, a unique video collaboration between the Irish Writers' Centre and Dublin UNESCO City of Literature, supported by Dublin City Council. Over the course of 6 videos, we will feature iconic writers from the past 50 years alongside today's contemporary and emerging writers. Each will share their writing journeys, their experiences of writing and performing in Dublin, and their thoughts on Dublin as a character in its own right. We will hear from writers making waves internationally, writers making Ireland their new home, and above all, writers who are adding to Ireland's rich legacy of literature on the world stage.
I'm delighted to introduce this first video as it features our own Irish Writers' Centre ambassador, acclaimed writer and playwright, Professor Joseph O'Connor, in conversation with journalist and writer Madeleine Keane. Filmed in Joseph's hometown of Dún Laoghaire, we hear how his memories of the streets and ghosts inspired his early years and influenced his entire writing career. I hope you enjoy.
Joe, talk to me about growing up in Dún Laoghaire. It was just a stone's throw from here, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Where we're meeting today, I'm looking out at the beautiful site that is the two arms of Dún Laoghaire's piers. And I spent so much time there as a kid, playing and messing around, but also walking through the ghosts of the many Irish writers who lived in the neighbourhood. You know, my parents were both Dublin City people from Francis Street in the Liberties, one of the oldest streets in Dublin, and they grew up there. So they had their own inheritance of stories and songs and poems from there. It's a very rich inheritance. James Clarence Mangan was from the Liberties, and John Field, the man who invented the nocturne, Chopin's close friend, from the Liberties, and Thomas Moore, indeed, who at one point somebody said everybody in the United States owned 2 books, a copy of the Bible and a copy of Moore's Irish Melodies. He was from Anger Street, just down the road. But they got married, they moved out here, and Dún Laoghaire was our playground. But my parents, who both had a strong interest in literature, had a great awareness of the fact that James Joyce had lived in this neighbourhood, and Samuel Beckett had written about Dún Laoghaire. The great John Millington Synge had lived here and had written most of his work here. And that some of the most important contemporary Irish writers in that time, of that time, including, you know, the peerless Ivan Boland, Maeve Binchy, and later Marion Keyes, you know, all had a connection with Dún Laoghaire. One of my favourite writers as a kid, Jennifer Johnston, who I started reading years before I knew she had a family connection with Dalkey. George Bernard Shaw. Because Dún Laoghaire was a port town, of course, many of the great international writers had been through what was then Kingstown. Everybody from Henry James to Charles Dickens landed at the port right outside where we're sitting today. So it was a great place of stories, a great place of storytellers and literary ghosts. And John Montague says in one of his poems about the old people in his neighbourhood, like dolmens around my childhood, the old people. But with me, it was like the writers were those dolmens, and I felt very close to them. And in the way that you might feel about a sports team or a band that came from your neighbourhood. I mean, I loved the Boomtown Rats because they came from Dún Laoghaire. I kind of love James Joyce for the same reason, and there's a little prickle of electricity or recognition when you read Joyce or Beckett, and you see a reference to Kingstown or Dalkey or Monkstown or Booterstown or this beautiful seafront that we're looking out on today. You kind of feel, yeah, I know what you're talking about because I've been there myself. So yes. It was a great place for a writer to grow up.
That's my hood.
That's my hood, yeah. And I still have a real sense of that. And I think that a writer's place of childhood enters their creativity in some way, so that if you're from Dublin, every city you write about will be seen through the lens of Dublin. Anytime I've written about a great city, be it London or Rome, I mean, there's a scene in my novel Star of the Sea where Pius Mulvey goes to London for the first time. It's operatic, symphonic, all the different sounds, all the different languages and sights and smells. And it was really me imagining one of the Connemara people that we knew as a kid coming to Dublin for the first time. Anytime I've written about a small town, I think it's sort of through the filter of Dún Laoghaire, and because I know what it's like to live in that kind of town. And anytime I've written about the sea, which is quite a lot, as it turns out in my career, I mean, the sea, in a sense, is a character in my novel Star of the Sea. I'm thinking about the sea out there in Dublin Bay. So it becomes part of your education and part of your apprenticeship, the place where you grew up. So I'm very fortunate to have grown up in, not just in Dublin, but in this particular part of the city, a few kilometres south.
It also has an edge, this place, and you memorably, a few years ago, writing in The Guardian, you described Dún Laoghaire as Skegness with nuns.
Yeah, well, I think you can overemphasize the beauty of the place. I mean, on a beautiful spring morning like today, with the sun glinting on the green and blue water, it is beautiful. But Dún Laoghaire was a port town, and like all port towns, it had a little bit of grit under its fingernails, and the ships came and went, and there's a transient population, and there were rough pubs as well as fancy restaurants, and you didn't go down to what was then the docks, you know, too late at night. The ferries used to actually go from Dún Laoghaire Pier. So it had all of the flavour and all of the salt and pepper of any seaside town, as well as this extraordinary literary inheritance. And of course that made it an even more delicious place to be, because we learn a lot from reading the lives of the saints, but we learn a bit more from reading the lives of the sinners. And Dún Laoghaire was a bit of a sin bin, as well as being the place where Yeats and John Synge had walked. And that's a very important part of its appeal to me.
We're in this wonderful library, the Lexicon, but you'll remember, as I do, also growing up here, the Carnegie Library.
The Carnegie Library, just off Georgia Street in Dún Laoghaire, I would say was like one of the lighthouses in my childhood, which wasn't a particularly happy childhood. I've mentioned that my parents were both into books, and I'm grateful to them for that. But it was an unhappy marriage, and there were times you wanted to get out of the house. And often, as a young teenager, the place where I went was Dún Laoghaire Library. Every time I pass it, I just feel such a huge sense of gratitude for the people who worked there, who, like librarians now, always do so much more than they're actually paid to do. And I remember going in there as a young kid and saying, like, I love English in school, and I love reading Dickens, and I love reading Yeats, but are there any Irish writers who are around now? Because extraordinarily, I didn't know that there were. I mean, the literary culture of Dublin then seemed very dead compared to what it is now. And I remember the old lady behind the counter saying, well, there's this book by Jennifer Johnston, and you know, she's the writer who has connections with the North and connections with here. She has family in Derry, family in Dalkey. Amazing. Here's this book, The Captains and the Kings, and it became, you know, almost a place of pilgrimage to me. That book just went going back to it again and again. In later life, I got to know Jennifer Johnston a bit, and I was always a bit starstruck meeting her, because she was one of the people who opened the doors of writing and storytelling to me. But it couldn't have happened without that building on Georgia Street in Dún Laoghaire that the great Mr. Carnegie gave his money towards. And funny enough, in later years, I was fortunate enough to have a fellowship at the New York Public Library on 42nd Street and 5th, right in the middle of Manhattan, the mothership of all libraries, just a splendid place.
We met for a memorable lunch there.
We did indeed. And there are 20,000 books on open display in the Rose Room of the New York Public Library, the largest room in the United States. But one of the lovely things about being a fellow there was that on the introductory tour, they took you down into the basement to show you the movable steel shelves that Mr. Carnegie himself designed to be able to fit just all of that massive amount of books into this hole in the ground. It's a former reservoir, the New York Public Library. But I was thinking, not just, God, that's a wonderful thing to see. I was thinking, as I stood there in the former reservoir on 42nd Street and 5th, about Georgia Street in Dún Laoghaire, and in any library that I ever go into, I am haunted by the library in Georgia Street in Dún Laoghaire. That was my place of refuge as a child. So in some sense, all libraries are that library, the same as all seas are that sea, and all towns are this one.
And there's something very moving about the fact that now in your 60s, here we are, and I just checked it out, and there's a whole shelf and a half of your books here, because we're up where the Irish authors are.
Well, I can tell you that if I had known that when I was 10 or 12, it would have changed the course of my teens. You know, it's a wonderful thing to have your books be published and read and translated into many languages, as mine have been, into 40 languages, and I've won awards and I've had #1 bestsellers and all of that, and it's absolutely great. But to have a copy of your book in Dún Laoghaire Library, there's really no feeling like that.
You've arrived, Joe.
At last. Yeah, it's about bloody time, but yeah.
So, bring me back then. Where would you say your writing journey began? When did the first seeds implant themselves?
So at home, there were a lot of books. My parents had a great sense of the Irish literary past. And I think they felt that, you know, this funny little kind of rainy country where we don't do a lot of things brilliantly. It's before the era of Colin Farrell and Irish people in movies and Irish people being in bands. It's the 1970s, and the sense that things are a bit black and white, and the secrets of Ireland, the fact that it sort of only exists because every few years hundreds of thousands of people emigrate from Dún Laoghaire Pier, many of them. My own uncles and aunts, who I remember saying goodbye to there on the pier and hello to when they came back. So it doesn't really work as a country, and it doesn't really work as a city. And it rains a lot, but we have this. Like, we have the greatest poet of the 20th century, William Butler Yeats. We have the greatest novelist of the century in James Joyce. We arguably have the greatest playwright of the century, one of the great dreamers and so daring a playwright as Samuel Beckett. And you look at the stuff that's being written now by Evan Boland, and you should probably know something about that. And I think they genuinely felt that, and I'm grateful to them that they did, because it wasn't handed on to us as homework. This was handed on to me as a kind of box of pleasures. You know, it's an unbelievable thing being an Irish person and a Dubliner, and owning this and knowing things about this body of work that other people wouldn't recognise. So there was that, and then they bought a lot of, you know, Poolbeg Press had just started, the kind of cheap paperbacks of Mary Lavin and Kate O'Brien and a new generation of Irish women writers. The books by John McGahern and that kind of generation, William Trevor novels were in the house, and I just used to pick them up and loved them. And the first time that I can remember really wanting to cross the border from being a reader into a writer was around a very specific John McGahern short story that was in his book Getting Through, which I know was published in 1972. There's a copy in the house. It's a story called Sierra Leone. It's set in Dublin, which people sometimes forget. John McGahern was a great Dublin writer, as well as the laureate of the Irish countryside and small town life. And it's the first time you read it, a very simple story. It's a couple who've had a troubled relationship, and they meet in a pub in a part of Dublin that they're not from every kind of Tuesday night to have a chat about what they're going to do and can they continue and must it end. And the story begins on the night that the relationship ends. And I became fixated by it, and I just loved the story. I read it over and over again, I wanted to know how it worked and why it was having the effect on me that it was having. So one night in the school jotter, I just literally wrote out John McGahern's Sierra Leone, word for word, sentence for sentence, just copied it out, just to know physically what it would feel like to write those beautiful sentences. And then a couple of nights later, I wrote it out again, and I sort of altered some of the punctuation, and I turned some of the commas into full stops. And over the course of about 2 years, I must have rewritten that story 100 times. There were periods of my life as a teenager when I could have had a fair stab at reciting it off by heart. And just piece by piece, phrase by phrase, you know, I remember changing the name of the man into my father's name and the name of the woman in the troubled relationship into my mother's name. An interesting thing in itself, that maybe there was some part of me trying to fix or explain what was going on in my own life using this story. And at some point the balance tilted and this absolutely beautiful John McGahern short story became 51% mine, having been subject to the wrecking ball of my teenage literary ambitions. And I used to feel that every short story I've ever written since has been in some way a response to that John McGahern short story. And in my later life, I got to meet John McGahern a few times, several of them in France, indeed, where he was revered. And I told him, I made my confession to him one night of how I had begun to write by copying out his story. And he looked at me gravely and he said, I think you owe me a pint.
I hope you bought him one.
Many that night. So then it was that, and then the other sort of key book text for me is when I was 17, my first girlfriend, who was from Dalkey, in County Dublin, just a couple of kilometres down from where we're meeting today, gave me a copy of Salinger's great novel, The Catcher in the Rye. Her parents had lived in New York, and they were rather kind of cool. There were pictures of them in the house in kind of Greenwich Village, jazz clubs and stuff. And her dad, who was a lovely man, it was his favourite novel, and she gave it to me. And I can remember finishing that novel. I could probably date it, Madeleine, if I thought about it carefully enough. I was 17. It was that autumn, heading into the Leaving Cert. I remember turning the last page of The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger and just thinking, that's what I'd like to do with my life. And it might work, it might not, but I would love to write something that has the vividness and the empathy and the power and the connection and the humour of that book. So I think it was a mixture of Dún Laoghaire and then my parents and J.D. Salinger and Dublin. And Catcher in the Rye is a great city novel. It's a novel about Manhattan. Holden Caulfield, the young fella who's the hero of the book, is an Irish American, which we often forget. And if you love books as a teenager, there's something so naughty about the opening paragraph of The Catcher in the Rye, where you meet this kind of sardonic, sarcastic, cheeky teenage kid who says, and I paraphrase, I suppose you want to know where I'm from, and where my parents were from, and what they did for a living, and all that other Charles Dickens crap. But I'm not going to tell you that. And when you read that, and you actually love Charles Dickens, you think, oh my God, like this voice is annihilating the 200-year-old tradition of the English novel in the opening paragraph of the book. It was like encountering punk rock for the first time. But really, it began in our troubled home where there were a lot of books, and I went to the books, I think out of some sense of their beauty and the great beauty of Irish and Dublin phrase-making, and then the sense that maybe I could be involved in this or belong to this in some way.
Yes, I mean, one of the many very attractive characteristics of your writing is that love of words. I mean, that's why I love reading you so much, because you just love words so much, and that is a very Irish thing, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I think it is part of our inheritance that is very special and very beautiful, and it's there in Irish conversation, it's there in storytelling, Irish stand-up comics. I mean, the work of like Tommy Tiernan and Deirdre O'Kane, the great Dave Allen, who I used to love as a kid, who all he did was sit on the stage and kind of tell stories, and they drew you in, and they were often very funny and then moving and then very funny again at the end. I mean, I used to think Dave Allen must be influenced by Flann O'Brien, you know, and Brendan Behan and that kind of storytelling. And I think we realise in Ireland that conversation, that only one purpose of conversation is to communicate, a very important one. But there's a sense in Ireland that language is performative. We express ourselves by language, not always exclusively through meaning. Our slang is very colourful in Ireland. Our idioms and expressions are very colourful. Even our swearing can be colourful. The particular way that Irish people use certain blunt words to kind of punctuate rather than just swear. And it's certainly there in our literary inheritance. And I just came to feel more and more as my career began that I wanted my sentences to be beautiful in themselves, to have euphony, as a critic would call it, to have musicality, and to have texture, so that you think about the length of one sentence versus the length of the sentence coming after it, that you think about the verbal. I mean, it's one of the reasons I love John Synge, former Dún Laoghaire man, is that, you know, he didn't reproduce how Irish people spoke. He took how they spoke and he turned it into something beautiful. And I think there's an amazing tradition of that running all the way from Swift through Synge, Joyce, obviously, up to my friend and colleague Donal Ryan, whose great ability, I think, is to have been able to take the language of Hiberno English as it is spoken in small town and rural Ireland and make this beautiful thing from it. So I think it's an important part of our inheritance, and it's something that I have thought about a lot as a writer, is that I have a kind of test, I suppose, Madeleine, which is that if I'm writing a piece, I sometimes imagine that if I'm giving a reading in a country where nobody speaks any English, like I'm reading in Taiwan, I'm just going to stand up and read this page, that I would want the people listening to have some sense of the emotion of the scene just from the sound of the words, so that it's not just the meaning at all. It's in the same way that there's all kinds of non-verbal communication, that language is communicating in 90 or 100 ways, and a lot of them are to do with sound. You know, and words are sounds before they're anything else. Our first encounters with language as young children are the lullaby and the playground song and the tongue twister and the nonsense rhyme. The owl and the pussycat went to sea in a beautiful pea green boat. Didn't happen, but so beautiful to say. And I think that's something that we've hung on to in Ireland. I think it's lovely that Joyce, who's the greatest prose writer who's ever lived, could do anything with the language. And he begins Portrait of the Artist as a young man by saying, once upon a time a moo cow was walking down the road, because he knows our experience of childhood language is so deep and so full of pleasures that he wants to evoke that for us. So that's a long way of saying, yes, I think about the musicality of words a lot, but I think many Irish people do. I've noticed it's something that great teachers that I had over the years did. Extraordinary Irish politicians have often been thought extraordinary because of how they speak. We love mimicry in Ireland. We love impressionists in Ireland, and we love that kind of recognisability of evoking, that's how you speak and that's how I speak, and the different accents of the country, from John B. Keane up to Van Morrison, that huge variety of the use of a language that is on paper the same, but it's in how it's spoken that it becomes different.
I'm going to bring you back to a character you mentioned there, indeed a real person, sing, because in a lovely kind of tie-in, as we've a great love of libraries, you and I, and what they do, and one of their great initiatives, One City, One Book, and your book Ghostlight was chosen for that, and that's about Singh, who of course, his house you passed most days going to school.
Yes, well, we lived in Arnold Grove, Glen Egeary, so for me to go to school involved walking down to Glasshill Village, down Adelaide Road, and you would pass a somewhat sombre, forbidding-looking house at that time, which in a certain light on a winter day was a bit like the Bates Motel. But I had a special reverence for it because my mother had told me that is the house where John Singh lived. And that room up there, she would point up at the room, that's where he wrote The Playboy of the Western World. He didn't write it in Connemara, he didn't write it in the Aran Islands, he wrote it in Dún Laoghaire. And his room looked up in the distance over Dalkey Quarry, where the stones had been taken back in the 1860s to build Dún Laoghaire Pier. The stanchions of Dún Laoghaire Pier come from Dalkey Quarry. The metals, the laneways that run parallel to the train tracks from Dalkey to Dún Laoghaire were built in order for those massive stones to be taken there. And I used to think of Singh walking the same pier as me and thinking about that and sitting at the end of the pier and making notes. He was a great man of Kingstown. I have him in the opening of my novel, Ghostlight, waiting in his garden for the train to come out from the city, listening for the train on a Sunday morning, where his young lover, the actress Molly Allgood, used to come out on a particular train. He would get on the train at Glen Egeary station and they would go out to Bray together because nobody knew them in Bray, so they could have their walk as a courting couple up Bray Head. There were taboos around the relationship. There were tensions because of the age difference. Singh was a Protestant, Molly was Catholic. Singh was from the ascendancy, actually, in a profounder way than Yeats was. Singh was from a landowning family. Molly was born, like my own grandparents, in a tenement in the inner city of Dublin. And Yeats and Lady Gregory, who loved Molly, they were her employers at the Abbey, they kind of didn't love this affair going on. They kind of thought Singh was unwise and leading her along and giving her false expectations and all of that. Anyway, they met, they were head over heels in love, and the place where the love affair would take off was Sandycove, what is now Sandycove Dart Station. It's just an amazing thing. That's where I went to school from. So I think of him a lot. He was a beloved, modest man, suffered a lot in his life, was ill for his whole life, died young, never had much personal happiness. No member of Singh's family ever saw one of his plays, for example. They had a particular set of very hardline biblical beliefs, which meant that the theatre was a place of idolatry, and actors, particularly actresses, were suspect. So they wouldn't go into town to see John, in the Abbey with all the Catholics. There's a little touch of that. So the secretness of the love affair, of course, interested me as it would any writer, and its closeness to this landscape and this seascape became part of my own writing career.
You mentioned your grandparents there, and I think you told me before that your father Sean was born in Francis Street. And isn't there a story there related to another character, and indeed a novel about the theatre, Shadow Play and Bram Stoker?
Yeah, so my dad, who was born in Francis Street in 1938, number 15 Francis Street, which was then a tenement house. It had been a fine house when it was built in the late 18th century, and it had dilapidated over the years, and on each floor of what was then a mansion was turned into a flat, and that's where my father was born. And very proud of his Liberties inheritance, and every Saturday morning to this day walks from his current home, which is in Ranelagh, Dublin 6, into the Liberties, and he communes with the ancestors and walks home again. But there was a great story of an ancestor of mine who was a lamplighter one of the men whose job was to go around, seems very glamorous to me, it probably wasn't to them, men who went around at dusk and they lit the gas lamps around the city of Dublin. We'll call him my grand uncle. I can't say specifically who he was, but an uncle on that side. And he's coming home from his rounds one night and he passes St. Michan's Church, which is on the north quays of the Liffey and is well known as a place where there are, or there were until recently, mummified bodies in the crypt. There's some quality of the soil that preserves bodies. So my ancestor is coming home, lamp lighting stuff in his back, and he sees a kind of well-dressed, rather portly man standing outside St. Michan's Church. And being a good dub, my great uncle goes over and says, "Are you lost? Can I help?" And this lovely man explains that no, he's not lost. I am waiting for the church to open. I want to go in and have a look at the crypt. My name is Abraham Stoker and I write ghost stories, so I'm really interested in the church. And my grandmother told me this story when I was 6 or 7, that like an ancestor of ours met Bram Stoker. I was gobsmacked. And she would continue to tell the story through the years of my childhood and teens, slightly exaggerating it every time, so that it sort of became that my great uncle and Bram Stoker would meet, you know, every Thursday night in the Flowing Tide for a pint. And by the time I was 16, Bram Stoker used to come round to the house for tea, you know, it's kind of, Bram Stoker is your father. So whatever the exaggerations, which I kind of loved, I found them very charming, and that the impulse for fiction was there in my grandmother too. She was doing what a lot of fiction writers do. I found it enthralling that one of my family had met this writer who changed the world through his novel Dracula. So I mean, I love Bram, and again, you know, Bram used to come here, walk the pier at Kingstown. Very interesting life before he became a writer, a bit like seeing a lonely man. His parents emigrated, leaving him by himself here. And he lived in a lot of little rooms and upstairs and dodgy little flats around Dublin. So he was another one of my Dún Laoghaire ghosts who ended up appearing in a novel of my own, Shadow Play, yeah. So you can see who I grew up with. It was Bram Stoker, Ivan Boland, Bob Geldof, Shaw, Joyce, Yeats, Beckett. They were my gang. You know, you could have had a worse gang than that.
And let's not forget Hugh Leonard driving around in his Rolls Royce, which
was the only writer,
great harbinger of hope.
Yeah,
for the budding writer.
Yes, well, the only living writer who I ever saw as a kid was Hugh Leonard, who you would have come to know well in your journalistic life. Jack, as he was, Jack Keys-Byrne, went off to the UK, became a very successful television writer, and moved back to Ireland in the mid-1970s to the village of Dalkey, which is where he was born, seaside village close to Dún Laoghaire. And he lived in a fantastic house on Collymore Road with a telescope in the window looking out over Dublin Bay, which you kind of felt he owned in some fundamental way. And he drove around Dalkey in a Rolls Royce. And I thought that's what happens to writers. You grow up, you get your house on Collymore Road and you get your Rolls Royce. So it was an era before there were literary festivals and the Irish Writers' Centre, the wonderful work that it does, and writers in schools and the wonderful things that the Arts Council does to bring writers into the lives of young people. I never remember going to a reading or knowing about any festival or ever seeing an author in a bookshop or in a school. The sense that I mentioned of the importance of Joyce and Yeats, it really was to do with the past. You know, the Joyce Tower was there, but it was a museum. Writers would sometimes appear on the banknotes. You know, there were statues of writers, but there wasn't the wonderful, vibrant, living literary culture that there is now in Dublin. Wasn't there at all. Hugh Leonard was that all on his own. He was literature's rock star, and he drove around in his Rolls Royce going, "Look at me." And he was a very fine writer. He won a Tony Award, and you know.
And wrote very affectionately about Dalkey. which
he
you
wrote
loved.
very affectionately and very in a very barbed way sometimes.
Well, that too.
I mean,
that
it's
too.
one of the... Hugh used to write a column for many years in the Sunday Independent newspaper, and I suppose his shtick was that he was a curmudgeon who
He revelled in it.
told it like it was, you know, and I say whatever I like. But I knew his guilty secret, because when I was about 12, I wrote him a postcard which I put in through the door of his house on Collymore Road, walking past the Rolls Royce. I said, "Dear Mr. Leonard, I would like to be a writer when I grow up. I have seen your play, Da, in the Abbey Theatre with my parents. What advice would you have for me?" And he wrote me back the kindest, gentlest, sweetest letter, which is full of very good advice. Do little pen portraits of your teachers and try and learn how sentences work. And in English, we sometimes say 80% of what we mean. And the job for the writer is, you can't always get it to 100%, but try. The best advice of all, try to love it, because it's a tough life. Try to love writing. So I always knew the curmudgeonly thing was a bit of an act, you know, and that actually he was a sweetie as well as a tough guy. And that's a good blend for a writer to be.
And you ended up living where he had lived, of course, famously, Pilot View.
Yeah, we were neighbours for a few years and got to know him a bit. It was a tough few years in his life.
I remember.
He was bereaved, and my office used to be at the front of this, I guess, courtyard of apartments, or U-shaped apartment development. So I looked out over the car park, and I remember seeing him in those months just looking put upon and tired and exhausted. We went one night, he gave me a wide berth, and then one night my wife Anne-Marie was away, and he was in the apartment by himself, and he put a postcard through my door and said, "Sure, come up, we've been living beside each other for a few years now, we've never met, so come on up." So we went up, I went up to see him on a Saturday night in the apartment, which is absolutely beautiful, looking out over the bay. And we drank a half bottle of whiskey, and he told me all his fantastic theatre stories, which were amazing. I mean, he's hugely accomplished, sometimes forgotten about writer, and what it was like the opening night of Da on Broadway, and going to Sardi's and waiting for the reviews to come in. And he took me upstairs and showed me the Tony Award and the typewriter where he wrote Da, and we embraced as I went home back to my own apartment, and we swore lifelong friendship. And I think the following Tuesday morning he shunned me in the car park. We never really spoke to each other again after that, but he was an amazing writer and an amazing presence. And I think another important thing about him, and about some of the writers who I worked with myself as a young university student, I always tried to get jobs in journalism in the summers from college. And it was a very interesting time in Irish journalism, where this new generation of Irish writers and editors like Colin Tobin and Fintan O'Toole and Mary Holland and the great Jean Kerrigan and Jack Hugh Leonard, who would talk about public affairs in Ireland. It was a new thing. I don't remember like the great John B. Keane ever getting involved in that. But there was a sense that there were secrets waiting to be told in Ireland, and that the writers knew them, and they would get involved in public debate. So there's a sense of the centrality of the writer in Dublin and in Ireland that hadn't been there before.
And let's not forget Vincent Browne, who gave you some advice. How could we forget Vincent?
Well, I have a great spot in my heart for Vincent, because when I was in the summer of first year in college in UCD, and I was determined to get some kind of job in journalism, and I wrote, and in these days it was hard, those days it was hard to do this. You had to get out your carbon paper and type your letter. I wrote to all of the nationals, all of the dailies, the trade press, Shoemakers Weekly, you know, Telephonists, Gazette, everybody. Please give me a summer job. The only person who wrote back to my 70 or 75 letters was Vincent Browne. And he said, "Come in and we'll have a chat." And he said, "What, do you have any experience as a journalist?" I said, "No." And he said, "Well, what ideas do you have for things you might like to write?" And I said, I don't have any ideas. He said, okay, I can see this is going to be difficult. But the Sunday Tribune was getting going at the time, and there were no files. Newspapers have files on people in case of obituaries or sudden news stories that break, whatever. So my job was to go down to the National Library and put together the file on the then president, Patrick Hillary. Just go through the microfiche, the Irish Press, the Irish Independent, over the many years of his presidency, see what he's been doing. If he opened a supermarket in Milltown, Malbay, make a note of that. If he visited a school, make a note of that, give us the file. So I did all of that, and then being a young, ambitious young reporter, I decided that I would also write the piece. So I wrote a piece that was very satirical, saying that in my opinion, as a lazy, good-for-nothing 20-year-old student who barely got out of bed, President Hillary wasn't doing enough to justify his salary, etc. And I handed it to Vincent and awaited the job offer. And Vincent called me back into the office and told me off in no uncertain terms. And the air went very blue as he explained that all the way through this piece, you've used the word I. I think that Patrick Hillary would be better. And in my opinion, he said, I don't give about you. You need to, if you were Conor Cruise O'Brien, he said, I might care about your opinion. I only might, if you were Conor Cruise O'Brien. I certainly don't care about yours. So go through the piece, take out the word I, which I did, and he put it in the Sunday Tribune the next day. So that was my first published piece, emerging out of a dialogue that involved some pain. But I'm very grateful for my training as a journalist. I sincerely am. I think it was a wonderful thing to be around all those writers when I was 19 or 20 who really valued how they wrote. I mean, Jean Kerrigan was always much more than just a reporter. I mean, he's a brilliant writer as well. Mary Holland, Nell McCafferty, all of those people would be around Dublin journalism at that time. And I valued the discipline that it taught. I still to this day value that when I was 19 or 20, I was involved in a kind of writing where it matters that you get it in on Tuesday at 2 o'clock, because it teaches you the habit of not waiting for the muse. I'm very blessed that I'm able to write when I have time. If I have 1 hour today, after you and I finish this conversation, I will be able to go home, switch on the computer or open the notebook and write. And I think I got that from an apprenticeship in the heady world of Dublin journalism in the 1980s.
Joe, I very much think of you as a novelist of the city. Your current wonderful trilogy, set in Rome, of course, shadow play, London. Talk to me about the city of Dublin as a character in your novels.
Well, I think that all cities in my books are versions of, or reinterpretations of, or recastings of Dublin, and very specifically the feelings that I had about Dublin myself as a teenager. And I should say that to grow up in the Dublin of the late 1970s and early 80s was a really remarkable thing, because you read the work of the previous generations of Irish writers about Dublin, and it's a place of paralysis, as Joyce says. The wonderful Tony Cronin, one of my favourite books about the Irish literary scene, Dead as Doornails, set in the post-war years in Dublin. Everybody's broke, everybody's bored, books are being censored, we probably will have to emigrate. It's a marvellous book because it's structured around a number of friendships, and 3 of his friends are Brendan Behan, Patrick Kavanagh and Flann O'Brien. So there's a portrait of three giants in the middle of the book. But Dublin was a place of kind of stasis and hypocrisy and nothing quite working. And then in the middle or the late 1970s along came In Dublin magazine and McGill and the Hot Press and Thin Lizzy and U2 started to make big in Dublin, and then would be in the NME, and then would be going on tour around Europe, and then in the States. So there started to be this cultural explosion, which was very, very similar to what happened in the years leading up to Irish independence, in that it was led by musicians, writers, poets, actors. Neil Jordan's films, I mean, young Irish people now would take it for granted that an Irish person would be able to direct an Oscar-winning movie. Absolutely unheard of at the time. And a very important part of his journey was that he'd been a writer first. Very important part of the Boomtown Rats lyrics is that they came from a storytelling place. So they had all the high octane energy of the music of the time. But if you listen to songs like I Can Make It If You Can or Rat Trap, the Boomtown Rats' big #1 hit, they're like little Irish short stories. So there was an explosion of creative talent that revitalized the city, with the result that I just loved going into the city. As I said, if there was trouble at home, I got on the bus, I went into town and I walked around the city. I kind of knew that if I walked down Grafton Street, I'm going to bump into somebody I know. There's something about the geography of Dublin. That's how it works. That's the same for you. It's how it works for all of us. American academics sometimes find it hard to swallow that in Joyce, people are always bumping into each other, but they are. It's something about the layout of the city. There was the Dandelion Market. There was exotic-looking people and ideas and beginnings of new voices and accents on Grafton Street, around Trinity, the Douglas Hyde Gallery. And there was a real sense that you lived in a kind of a storybook anthology, that this wasn't a flat, dead little place, that this was a collection of stories waiting to happen all around you. Change and development and old ways dying, amazing new writers like Dermot Bulger publishing their own stuff. Again, unheard of. It used to be, probably still is a bit, the notion that an Irish writer had to be published in London, really. You know, there were always publishers here, but like the A-League, the Premier League was London. But along came Dermot Bulger, Raven Arts Press, going, we'll do our own books, we'll do our own posters, we'll put on shows at the Project Art Centre, the Sheridan brothers, all of that. So it was a hugely exciting city. So every city that I've ever written about since, be it London or Manhattan or Rome, has been a place of excitement and noise and glamorousness and colour and the clash of different kinds of music. But at heart, they're always translations of the Dublin that I grew up in myself. Ropes on masts, the sea murmuring, the clank of ropes on masts, the bats, Teddy's ice cream, the tang of chips and vinegar, salt breeze, sea wrack, gull cry, dogs, lost mongrels trotting the sleepy metals, haughty cats in windows, Boomtown Rats, the holy aromas of Cabaston's Deli, Mr. Clegg's key cutting and shoe repair shop, Dorky. Once, as a child, I saw Hugh Leonard on Castle Street, handsome as a magi, grave as Yeats. Old Sandycove shops, dead wasps in the windows. Forum Cinema, a week before demolition. Faded poster for Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock, late show. Martello Tower, stately, plump. The People's Park, my first proper kiss. The bandstand on the pier where she broke my heart. Dog walkers, lugubrious foghorns, the ghosts of drowned lifeboat men, of Shaw, Synge and Beckett, a tousled, speckled Daedalus sitting on a wall, the benches by the lighthouse, on one of those August midnights when you could reach out your hand to stir the stars around in the sky. Borough of steeples, chapels and bars, the Druid's chair, the discos of summertime, heavy metal howling from a pub on George's Street, smoke on the water, smoke in the sky. Michael's church in Dún Laoghaire that burned to the ground, new church they built with the black rubber floor, old lady saying it smelt like a bicycle shop. Chinese girls on Bullock Harbour buying crabs from the fishermen, Africans in multicoloured robes playing football on Glasthule Green, and the ghost of the Pavilion Cinema, Taj Mahal of pasteled glamour, like a luxury liner that sailed up from the harbour and moored itself, majestic, in the Saint-Tropez of Marine Road. Mariners' Church, with its special barred gallery for prisoners who were brought there to praise the god of oceans. Afternoon tea at the Royal Marine, elderly gentlemen playing crown green bowls, grass stains on the knees of their white ironed slacks, forever young, forever in Kingstown. Punk beauty on the pier, hand shading her eyes as she gapes across the billows at the astonishment of Howth, and the sea always murmuring, the clank of ropes on masts, as Banville has it in his book of evidence, like the sound of a Chinese orchestra. My Dublin is not pints in Temple Bar, but a coast town of ghost ferries embraced by two piers, lost stories of emigrants down all the long years, sailors, dream fishers, from near and from far.
So Joe, we're sitting in the Joyce Tower Museum, very near to where we both grew up. Mm-hmm. And of course, does every writer begin and end with Joyce, really? Dublin writers, particularly.
Well, I do, in the sense that his physical presence as embodied by the tower was just part of my daily kind of streetscape on the way to school or to meet friends. I walked past the tower most days when I was in my teens. The 40-foot, which is very nearby, where the first chapter of Ulysses ends, was kind of where my mates and I hung out on a Saturday night, and the odd can of beer might have been had down at the 40-foot, and the odd teenage romance was conducted there, and you looked at the ferries heading out to sea and you knew that you would be on them one day. Not quite aware at that point of the great story of exile and homecoming that James Joyce's Ulysses is. But as I grew up and as I started to read the book, which I've read every couple of years since I was in my 20s, I came to love it more, and I came to be very glad to have been brought up on or near a seascape that was so important to Joyce. His great novel Ulysses begins here, moves around the bay, often refers to the river and to the coast and to Howth. But so there was that very special of pleasure of recognition, if you came from this hood, that when you were reading Joyce, you were reading about a place that you knew. So I've come to love the book more in the course of my career. When the first time I read it as a student in my early 20s, I disliked Ulysses, and I wrote a lot of very stupid essays about it. And my theory is that a young person reading Ulysses will sometimes not like it, because Stephen Dedalus, who is the young student character in it, is hard to like. But as you grow older and you re-encounter the warm, generous, curious, flawed person who is Leopold Bloom, and his love of Dublin, his curiosity about people, his great store of knowledge of facts about the city, that helped me to fall in love with the book. So I've been through it 5 times now, and I've loved it more every time.
Do you need a medal for that? I think we should give you one. 5 times. That's love, Joe.
Well, I do love the book.
Yeah.
Every time I come back to it, I see something more in it. There's no doubt parts of Ulysses are challenging, and it's too long. And Roddy Doyle said a few years ago that Ulysses could have done with a few good edits, and some people got a bit shocked, but he was absolutely right. But in a way, it needs all the messing. It needs all the kind of strange experimentation that it tries. Most of the time it succeeds, sometimes it doesn't. You know, my favourite chapter in it's Sirens, the kind of chief art going on in the background is music. And the prose is just becoming very musical. It's almost like Brian Eno or Jimi Hendrix. It's Joyce, who would have been a musical genius if recording studios had been available then, is approaching language just in terms of pure sound. So I always say to people, including my students, if they're finding difficulty reading it, listen to it. I mean, there is a wonderful recording of Ulysses that is available online. And it helps to carry you through the bits that get difficult. Because it's voiced by actors, even in the very abstract bits, they kind of have to find some narrative and some meaning. The very long chapter set in Nighttown, where it's nightmarish, it has the kind of logic of a dream, but it's hard to follow. It's much easier to listen to, and parts of it are just breathtakingly beautiful, and it's so full of truth and so rooted in this city and in my part of it, but at the same time truly is a novel about the whole world. So I don't think we should destroy it by over respect either. Like, to me, Ulysses is like an album, and we have favourite tracks, and we have some bits that we skip over. Some songs we don't like so much on a concept album, and we just press forward. I think that's okay too. But I've had an ongoing relationship with Ulysses, I suppose, since my early 20s, and I've come to love it very deeply and to find it a book of great pleasures.
The novel of yours that I love most deeply of all, as you know, is your magisterial Star of the Sea, which for me has echoes of Joyce in it. I very much felt Joyce in it when I read it, and I've read it a few times.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because when I set out to write Star of the Sea, I realised one thing about it. I'm very glad I realised it early, which is that you're not a good enough writer yet to write this. Like, you're good, and early books have been fine, and you've given 100%, but you're going to have to become a better writer than you actually are in order to write this book. It's going to have to go to 102%, because it's a big, long book. It's got many characters. It's going to have to be orchestrated. There will have to be architecture and engineering of a kind that there wasn't in any of my early kind of comic books. So I set out to read the novelists who I think have achieved most in that regard, including Peter Carey, who's one of my heroes, Toni Morrison, another one of them. But I absolutely looked at Joyce to see, how do you use the sound of words to bring the texture of scenes to life? Like, how am I going to make the sea be a character in this book? How am I going to write anything about the sea and how it sounds that hasn't been written 5 million times before? And Ulysses is a great textbook as well as everything else. It teaches you how to live, it will teach you how to read, but it will certainly teach you more about how to write. And I read Ulysses carefully in the run-up to writing Star of the Sea, and I continue to learn so much from it. But in terms of how to orchestrate the music of prose, as I tried to do in Star of the Sea, really for the first time in a novel of mine, Joyce was a great and a strict but a loving teacher.